Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Mario Hervas wash processed Ecuador from Scenery Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Scenery, based out of London, England. And this is their third ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed a couple of their coffees towards the end of last year. And truth be told, I didn't necessarily have the best results with either of those two coffees, and that was demonstrated in our most recent European coffee roaster tier list. But I also mentioned in that tier list that Scenery was probably the coffee roaster least indicative of how good they actually are when compared alongside the other coffee roasters featured in that tier list. So when I found out Airworks was bringing them back in, it felt like a great opportunity to try out some more of their coffees, including this one, which is a Mejorado coffee. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how both of them turned out, as this right here is day 50. Now, recipe we went with for this coffee was the recipe we found on Scenery's website, which interestingly enough is different from the recipe that they do have on the back of their bags. I found that out just before recording this review, and I wish I would have known before starting this review, as we probably would have tried out both recipes as they are quite different from each other. Now, the recipe that they do have listed on their website is roughly a 16.12 to 1 water to coffee ratio, so it's 62 grams to 1 liter, and the one that they have on the back of their bag is 60 grams to 1 liter. And then the temperatures that they have on the website is 93 degrees Celsius, which is about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the back of their bags, it is 98 degrees Celsius, which I think translates to about 208 degrees Fahrenheit. And we did opt for the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Now, roast profile for this one, I don't know if my memory serves me well with these Scenery coffees, but this one actually did feel a little lighter than the previous experiences that we did have with them. Now, I don't know if they've gone a little bit lighter in the past 6 months or if it's pretty similar to the other coffees, but we previously mentioned that their coffees did feel significantly lighter than the vast majority of any other English-based coffee roasters we'd reviewed in the past. We actually said that we definitely saw a lot of the inspiration that they had from Calendar, which is a pretty light roasting Irish-based coffee roaster, and that definitely still holds true with this one, as I can say that this one skews on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression through the V60, and this coffee honestly felt like it wasn't quite ready to be brewed yet, as it did have a slightly generic feel to it with a very slight fruit bitterness as well. Profile did feel similar to the other Scenery coffees, if maybe just a tad lighter than those earlier experiences. Few takeaways based off of this first impression, but otherwise an okay start. Day 25 through the Chemex, and the coffee was already a bit better today as there was more sweetness and brightness, demonstrating greater potential within this coffee. Apple-like in a number of ways, both within the sweetness and brightness as well. Still a little bit of that fruit bitter quality, however, it's notably less prominent than it had been on the first impression, so as a result, I definitely felt like there was a lot of potential within this one. It probably just needed a little bit more time to open up as well. Day 28 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee does seem to be steadily improving each time we brew it, as it's quite nice off brew with a little more of the sugary fruit qualities once again. It does cool off into a slightly generic sense with more of the fruit bitterness, but it is still demonstrating great potential. I continued to feel like it just needed more time for it to really open up. Day 31 through the V60 with Scenery's recipe from their website, and the coffee isn't quite as good as some of the earlier days, as it still feels like there's plenty of potential within this. However, it was only moderately sweet, still offering a softer profile and a very slight fruit bitterness, so there weren't a lot of takeaways on this one. I continued to feel like it probably just needed a little bit more time, and truth be told, on this day, I wasn't entirely sure which direction I would have gone with this coffee if we didn't have a Scenery recipe. I couldn't quite tell if I wanted to go lower on the extraction or push the extraction on this one based off of previous experiences with Mejorado coffees. But seeing that their website suggested some lower extraction adjustments, that's the direction that we opted to go for, and it didn't necessarily yield to the best results on this day. We'll go ahead and move on to day 34 as we opted for the Chemex with Scenery's recipe, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it's finally offering a fair bit more of the expected Mejorado sweetness with a little less of that earlier fruit bitterness. Apple-like in a number of ways once again, but a better day overall, as basically I was sweetness hunting within this coffee. It's a Mejorado coffee, so of course that's what I wanted to get out of it, and this day 34 was the best representation that we had had as of this moment. Day 37 through the V60 with Scenery's recipe from the website once again, and the coffee does continue to underperform within this brew method as it's offering less sweetness and a little less intensity overall. A little bit more generic today with a slight citric aspect to it as well. And I think what's kind of frustrating about this is I probably would have tried, well, I know for a fact I would have tried the recipe that they do have on their bags had I actually seen it, because I've been curious the majority of the time what would have happened if we had actually pushed this coffee, and I probably should have gone that direction within this day 37 mark, as it did feel like a good opportunity to try that out. But given that we did have some nice results with the other coffee that we're going to be discussing from Scenery, as well as with the Chemex with this recipe, I just felt like maybe some persistence, maybe some time would really seem to help improve with this coffee, but it really didn't with this brew method, as I really wasn't enjoying the way that it did turn out with that recipe with that brew method, the V60. Day 40 through the Chemex with Scenery's recipe, and there has been a fair bit of inconsistency with this coffee, as it's not quite as good as the previous Chemex day, offering a slightly more tame presentation of those apple-like characteristics once again. A slight bit of brown sugar sweetness, but for the most part it's all presented within a tame sense, so this was an okay day. And on day 43, we opted back for the Chemex with Scenery's recipe, and the coffee is still a little bit more toned down than expected, with a little less of the sweetness relative to the average Mejorado in a slightly more tame presentation. So I feel like that might have been what this coffee was intended to be, given that they do have that elegant note listed on here. So you can either say tame or elegant. I feel like one's a much prettier word to say for something that is pretty similar. Apple characteristics at the forefront, but it is complemented by some slightly lighter grapes and a very soft peach after an extended cool down, as I found this coffee to be the very best once it has cooled down significantly. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Okay, and we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through them. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Certainly nothing to take away from the cleanliness on this one whatsoever. It's a pretty clean coffee through and through. It's presented in a slightly more tame, and I would say for the most part, pretty well-defined sense for the qualities that it does offer, even if they aren't necessarily the most intense. So cleanliness was always going to be there at that level 4 mark. Finish, level 4, and the finish is a little bit interesting because at times it can be presented in a very soft citric sense. At times towards the end we were able to get a little bit more depth to it in that slightly peachy sense, but for the most part it had that kind of lingering sugary quality that I can expect from Mejorado coffees in general. So level 4 we've opted to put that. That's largely because of those sugary qualities to it. Florality, level 4. I do believe that the floral note they have listed on here is something along the lines of an orange blossom, and I can definitely see that. It's a little bit of a citric florality to this one. I can also see some of those very slight Mejorado honeysuckle-like qualities to it as well. Maybe not necessarily to the intensity that I usually expect from a coffee like this, but presented enough to justify this one being there at the level 4 mark, largely because of those slightly more citric floral qualities to it. Citrus fruit, level 4. And that's going to be the apple characteristics to this one. Definitely the most abundant, definitely the most prominent. It was the first note that they did have listed on here, and I don't know if their priming effect is at play whatsoever, but I do have to say that that's continuously what I continue to get from this coffee every single time we brewed it, was largely the sweetness and the brightness, both presenting in that sense in a slightly more tame and subdued sense. So level 4 where we opted to put that. Let's go through the level 3s. We will start with the sweetness level 3. Yeah, that's a little frustrating for a Mejorado coffee to have the sweetness be a little bit more toned down. I definitely could say on at least one of the days it was at least at that level 4 mark, very much on par with the expectations for what we had for this coffee going into it. But I think the sweetness is largely representative of the fact that it's definitely not as sweet as the average Mejorado. I mean, we review so many Mejorado coffees on this channel that I think that there's a certain expectation that they'll have a certain level of sweetness, and this one didn't quite reach that, so level 3 is where we opted to put that. Acidity level 3, while it does have that apple-like brightness, it's also presented in a slightly more subdued sense, so level 3 is where we opted to put that. I can't help but shake the feeling that maybe had we pushed this coffee a little bit more, we were able to bump those both up to a higher level, largely the sweetness, but even then, on the earlier days, it didn't have that level of sweetness that we were expecting, so I'll just kind of make do with what we have, level 3 for both of those qualities. Grapefruit level 3, mentioned that there were some slightly lighter grape qualities towards the end within this one. I could definitely see like a white grape characteristic to it, which did seem to give this one a little bit of fruit depth, and then the stone fruit there at the level 3 mark as well. Definitely enjoyed the peachy quality of this one. I feel like had I known it was presented within it and you could get that in a more intense sense, I probably would have hunted a little harder to get that out of this coffee a bit more, but level 3 where we opted to put that. And then the final thing worth discussing, the body at a level 2. Probably a big component to brewing this one within the Chemex, especially at a, I'll go with, yeah, I guess that's a slightly higher or lower concentration, I guess 16.12. And as a result, bit lighter bodied in that sense. We've said in the past that those two characteristics, the body and the brightness, can fluctuate. Body between a 2 and a 3 when it comes to Mejorado coffees, acidity between a 3 and the 4. So I guess those are both in line with what we usually get from Mejorados. So as a result, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I have quite a bit, so I think the first thing I should say is a lot of the feedback I've heard from others about this coffee. I've heard from 1 or 2 people that they really enjoyed this coffee. I've heard from significantly more people that this coffee never reached the level of expectations that they had as well. I also heard from one other person that last year's version of this Mario Hervas was significantly better than it as well. So that's just basically what I've heard. And I think the only thing I can kind of compare this coffee to is the only other Mario Hervas that we'd reviewed, which was from Café Circular last year. And truth be told, I was a little underwhelmed by that coffee as well, given that it was a Mejorado coffee. So for that reason, I guess it's not too surprising based off of the limited experience that I do have with this coffee specifically, that I haven't been as big of a fan of this specific Mejorado when compared with a number of the other ones that we reviewed from a number of other producers as well. So I'm not going to knock Scenery at all for this coffee. I'm going to say that based off the experiences that we've had from this producer, maybe this one isn't just necessarily in line with my own preferences, but that's not to say that this coffee wasn't good whatsoever. I think my big sticking point with this coffee is I feel like I could have gotten a lot more out of this coffee. I feel like the sweetness is there to be found. I feel like whether it's a little bit more rest, whether it's pushing this coffee a little harder, whether there's just something different that we need to do to get more out of this coffee, it's there to be found. And I'm hoping that more people that had this coffee were able to find the best of it, because it's certainly there. I definitely saw the potential of the sweetness within this one, and I definitely saw some fruit depth within this one. So I do know that there's a lot more to be found within this coffee. I just didn't necessarily do the best job of getting it out within it. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it is a slightly more tame and subdued presentation of a Mejorado coffee, but even then it does still offer some of those characteristics to it. Largely in that sugary sense, I was able to get some more of those sugary characteristics, even if they were presented in a slightly more toned down sense. Outside of that, it is pretty clean. That's the main thing I wanted to highlight and emphasize within this coffee, offering some nice fruit depth and qualities to it as well, with a complementary floral aspect, all of which presented in that more elegant sense we'll go with. I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Mario Hervas wash processed Ecuador from Scenery Coffee. Thank you for watching.